Hey there, YouTube. I'm Ikitsu. This is the Ikitsu Times. Welcome to my channel. Welcome to a little bit of Sins of the Solar Empire 2. So I'm going to be talking about each of the factions as a sort of whole and what I think about them and their roster. We're going to be focusing primarily on military for this one, but for this one, the start of Vasari, we're going to be talking a little bit about their economy because there's some very interesting things that we have to talk about with that. We are starting with Vasari, which is the one I think that I'm least qualified to talk about, and we're going to be moving towards the one that I'm most qualified to talk about. But this is my thoughts on the faction and the way that they sort of work there. So for Vasari, during the early game, they've got a very interesting sort of situation going on compared to Tech or Advent, because instead of having like a base and some preliminary stuff built up, they're instead given a gigantic amount of resources, including valuable exotic resources at the start. And one of the things that this can lead to is instead of getting a sort of smooth curve of different resources invested by the Vasari player, instead of having a bunch of different things that they've got going on for themselves, they can just slam down like a trio of ship producing factories. They can then start slamming out ships at a horrendous pace and just use that for a rush strategy. And if you're playing as Tech or if you're playing as Advent, you've got the option to try this kind of strategy yourself, but you're never going to be as fast at this as a Vasari player with their opening hand of resources, especially if you're trying to go for a capital ship early building, which is something that you can do as Vasari, but you can't do as anyone else. So let's take a look at how this sort of interacts with things. Let's say that you're playing as the Advent and you're playing into Vasari, and you've decided, you scouted the Vasari, you can see that they're building let's say they're building raiders as their opening. If you're playing as Advent and you see that opener, you have to respond to that and take it very, very seriously, because if you don't have the exact perfect counter unit against the Raider, let's say that you're like, oh, well, I'm just going to hedge my bets and I'll build a whole bunch of, say, Disciples, because they're kind of okay against most things. They don't really do that well against Raiders, but, if he sort of has a bunch of stuff, then they'll kind of be able to fight that other stuff, and then they'll struggle against the Raiders, but we can fight them by doing some micro tricks or whatever. This is going to end up being disastrous, because you're not going to have enough Disciples to really do anything meaningful to those Raiders that are not hard countered by Disciples. If you could build Acolytes as a counter to them, which go kind of 50-50 to Raiders, they're a little bit stronger than Raiders for the cost, you're still going to get annihilated, because there's going to be way more Raiders than there are Acolytes. You have to get the Tempest, or you have to get Carriers, or you have to get something similar to that, so that you can have any hope at all of fighting against those Raiders. You have to have the correct response unit if the Vasari player has decided to go all in on a unit type. So what this means is that early resource pool for the Vasari gives them the initiative during the early game. They are allowed to decide what the early game is about, and Tech or Advent have to respond to that. Now, you could, as the Vasari player, decide that the early game is going to be about building up a conventional economy. We're not going to try to cheese. We're not going to try to rush or anything like that. But it's on the table for you in a way that it's not for the Advent or Tech players. So even though Vasari ships are not necessarily the most cost efficient, and certainly during the early game, you're out cost efficiency by both Tech or Advent in a lot of ways there. But you're still the one that's capable of deciding what the early game is going to be about. You can force it to be about conflict. You can force it to be about economy. You can force it to be whichever one you sort of want it to be, because your opponent has to respond to you. So this is a huge advantage for the Vasari during the early game. It gives them that sort of initiative. It lets them sort of take the pace that they want to a certain extent there. Now, if they do get hard countered, that can really, really suck for them, because they are behind in terms of income. Having that extra resources comes at the cost of not having any resource production. So the longer the game sort of goes on, the more Tech and the more Advent are going to start catching up to that initial resource opening pool that you've got access to. So one of the things as well that I would just want to comment is they keep slowing down the economy to this game. And every time they slow down the economy, Vasari early game gets a little bit stronger, because that makes it take that little bit longer to receive the amount of resources that lets you catch up to Vasari's opening. So that's something that just you should keep in mind there. Every time that patch happens, Vasari early game gets stronger, which they've done for quite a few consecutive patches there. Right now, I do think that it's still possible. It's absolutely feasible to just beat a Vasari opening. I don't think that they're invincible, but there could conceivably be a point where the Vasari player could just immediately face roll, immediately get Tosserax, and or maybe they get all Counteract Assailants or something like that, and they would literally be able to beat a Tech or an Advent player no matter what those players did. Because even if they spent every single penny that they had on building up their military to try and match the Vasari military, because that opening pool of resources is so strong relative to that slow gain of resources, the Vasari player would just inevitably always win. That's not happened yet, but that is something that I think you need to sort of worry about. Or maybe it has happened and I just haven't seen anyone execute that yet. But anyway, we're going to be dividing this up in between the sort of early game, which is going to be tech tier 1 and 2. We're going to be focusing on just the military techs for this particular purpose. Middle game is going to be Warfare 3. We're going to have the sort of mid-late or late game, which is going to be 4, and then there's going to be the late game, which is 5. There's a very, very late game, which I don't really have any qualifications about, which is when you've replaced all of your cruisers and all of your frigates with capital ships. There's a certain point in the game where you could have like full population, but you have 0 regular ships, and they're all like fully leveled capitals. That's not really something I've ever done. It's not really something I've ever seen, so I can't really comment on that sort of hypothetical situation other than in the most abstract sense there. So, like I said, in the early game, tech tier 1 and 2, Vasari has the initiative, even though their ships are generally speaking the least cost efficient of their sort of type there. There's one exception to this. The Counteract Assailant is actually fairly efficient at its type, but unlike the other ones, it's countered by more different things. Whereas something like, say, the Raider, there's actually only a small number of ships in Advent or Tech rosters that really effectively counter the Raider, making it so that if they're not being perfectly sort of selected against, they can sort of definitely do a lot of damage. Same thing with the Tosseract. It's not necessarily going to be able to win a lot of fights against its peers. For example, if the Tech player goes for a bunch of Shriken, those will beat the Defensor by cost. However, if there's an opening, if the Vasari player decides to go for a Defensor opening, then they will beat a Shriken opening by the Tech player. And the reason for that is going to be that the Vasari are going to come out with a lot more of the Solserax than the Tech player is capable of matching. Especially because the Tech player is forced to go into Tech Tier 2 and get these shields. Otherwise, they are outmatched by the Solserax, which is really, really bad. The other option that they've got for openings is they could go for the Carastra, they could just go for a Planetary Snipe. This fortunately has been heavily nerfed, so it's less of a concern currently. They could go for a Counteract Assailant build, like I mentioned there, but unique to them, they've also got the option to open with 3 capital ships. They're capable of getting a trio. The difference of different types is going to depend on what your sort of what combinations you've looked through there. But being able to start with these different openings, it can do a lot for a Vasari player, getting them access to early aggression against an enemy there. So I think that all of these different openings are quite good for the Vasari player, and it makes it so that I would say that they're currently the strongest early game faction. By a pretty decent amount there. If you're sort of forced to fight against like an early game Tech player, their ships are kind of weak, so it's not really a huge deal, even though they're capable of producing an okay amount of them, and they're sacrificing their ability to produce a lot of their higher tier tech. They're sacrificing a lot of their trade outposts to get that early attack there. The Advent player has a relatively weak economy until they really work hard to scale it, so they have to sort of invest into economy tech if they want to really get their economy rolling. So if they go for a very, very aggressive early push there, they're kind of punished for it because they'll never get their economy, especially credits, rolling in there. And going for a very early Vasari play with aggression, doesn't really hurt them that much at all. So they're positioned in the best way to have that sort of tempo during the early game there, making them quite strong during this phase. I think that the roster does need some minor adjustments, but not really from their end. I think that the counters against their units, especially the non-direct counters, the ones that are sort of middling, need to be boosted against Vasari. In particular, I think that there should be a little bit more to the Caliph. The Caliph's a little bit weak. I think that that's one of the only currently existing tier 1, tier 2 counters against a Vasari 3 capital push. Advent doesn't really have one at this point in time. Having something added in that might do that might be okay, but the thing that I think they really need is a bit more variety of things that work into their Corvettes. In particular, I think that just the Tempest right now is just way too weak, making it so that it's hard to justify taking that into Raider composition. And the Sulcerax also kind of soft counter them, so that kind of doesn't help that much if you're getting attacked by a bunch of defensors. So yeah, like Advent right now, I think just needs like some minor adjustments in terms of the ships that they can bring against those sort of compositions that Vasari could take during the early game there. However, I would potentially change the Raider from being tier 1 and push it into tier 2, while maybe moving the Junserak down to tier 1, having them swap places. The reason that I would say that this is a possible way of dealing with this is I think that actually the Tesseract is a little bit too impactful if it's in tier 1. Being able to rush that out really, really quickly is the primary way that you can sort of make the best use of it. But right now, with all the economy being slowed down for everybody, and the fact that that compensates for that by giving you more eco, it kind of leads to a sort of situation where it becomes a little bit too powerful if it's played correctly, in my opinion. And I want, instead of that really sort of surprise ambush thing behind the Tesseract, there's other things I want it to be able to do where I want it to be improved more in the late game with additional tech in tier 3. So that's something that I think might be beneficial there. I haven't mentioned the Sotra or the Serevan. Those are also existent, but they're probably not going to be meaningful to your early game strategies. The Serevan's aura is kind of okay, but the Sotra just doesn't really do that much for you during the early game, since you don't have access to debris reclamation just yet there. Now, heading into the sort of mid-game, you gain access to the Lacerak and the Cortovas, and both of these are very tough ships that are capable of letting you sort of hold the line against a variety of different strategies that the Tech or Advent player might throw at you. And because they both have point defense on top of them, they're both okay into a wide variety of targets while not being amazing into too many of them. They're good all-arounder choices that sort of let you do okay into a wide variety of things that your opponent might throw at you. But this is where Vasari by far are going to be the weakest. By the time you hit sort of the Tech 3, you've long blown through your opening stockpile of resources. And if you didn't manage to make that really, really count for you, then your Advent peers or your Tech peers, they're going to have rocketed ahead of you in terms of their income, especially tech players. And because of that, you're sort of a little bit more on the defensive at this stage of the game, because not only are you a little bit more on the back foot in terms of resource gain, but your ships at this point in time are no longer running around as roughshod. The Raiders are no longer really all that relevant. The Sulcerac is really not that relevant anymore. The Junserak is still potentially really good if your opponent is going into a lot of ordnance that they can shoot down. The Canrak Assailant is starting to see more of its counters out there, since like by now, if you've been balling Canraks, the Tech player has absolutely been able to just storm out there with a huge number of Guard of Flak frigates, and an Advent player could easily start getting the Vigilus at this point in time. So it's having a harder time being out there and being super relevant. But it's still very, very strong into Tech Tier 3. And then, of course, like I said, the Lacerak and the Cortovas, they're not game-defining ships. They're not ones that you can build and then win off the game, especially because they did nerf the Lacerak quite heavily in terms of the fighter damage. Now you have to build the very lackluster bombers to be able to deal damage with the Laceraks, and they're so lackluster that you're not going to knock out an opponent with those. It's not really happening. leaving you with the sort of option of like building up more of your sort of lower tier ships or transitioning over into more a capital heavy ship fleet here, which you don't really have any great advantages towards in tier 3. You have got some advantages in tier 1, tier 2, especially your opening resource pool, but you also have access to slightly better searches, but you're not in the sort of situation where you're getting like 2 capital ships or 3 capital ships for every capital that a tech or an advent player is capable of getting. Um, in the late game, you're in tier 4 here. You get access to the Volrak. I've mentioned before this about the Volrak. It's not a good ship. It needs to be in perfect condition in the exact right place, the exact right time to actually do anything at all. And otherwise, it's just kind of a waste of space there. You're probably not going to be building them, especially not in Tech Tier 4. If you do build them, they're kind of lackluster with a role. There's other things that would be better into that sort of situation there. I just don't think that they're a great ship overall. And we'll get into what I think you can do about this in a little bit here, but this is where what you're going to see is typically like transitioning hard into more capital style fleets, because you get access, of course, to your command ships and your Titans. Your Titan and command ship for Vasari, if you're playing as Alliance, are hyper powerful. They're some of the most powerful in the game. Solarkin is not necessarily that scary, but it is a very solid presence overall. It's capable of definitely bolstering your fleet's overall fighting capability, and it's extremely, extremely tough. But the Koltorask is just game defining in terms of how powerful it is. I would actually say it's one of the very few that I would recommend just building offhand. Especially because in this phase, like that's really one of your better options. You could spam a lot of capital ships, or you could just continue falling back on your lower tier ships, because an interesting thing happens at around Tech Tier 4 for Vasari, and that is that you're now looking at a situation where your weapons have outscaled other people's possible scaling. That is because Vasari has higher percent bonuses from their tech, and they take a while to catch up. They take a while to like supersede what other people are capable of doing. And Tech 4 is where you start seeing your ships jump from being like kind of inefficient compared to Tech or Advent in terms of like their cost efficiency, to being either close to parity or a little bit behind or a little bit ahead. But regardless, you're no longer in that situation where your ships are not efficient compared to Tech or Advent ships, as long as you've gotten enough of those sort of like upgrades to your ships there. If you got like energetic pulse charging for that plus 42% there, you've got like the beam upgrade at plus 36% or whatever it is. All of those sort of bonuses make it so that your ships are capable of laying out way more damage. Your ships are way tougher than they would normally be for their cost. And it just makes it so that you're just way more capable for your value than you were in previous tech tiers. So if you were losing a fight earlier because you invested heavily in Revester skirmishers and your opponent just went straight for Cobalt light cruiser, light frigates, and you sort of are fighting that sort of fight the entire time, you're kind of going close the entire time. By Tech Tier 4, you're going to see that swinging a little bit more in your direction, where your Revester skirmishers are outdoing the damage that the Cobalt light frigates are capable of doing. You're surviving a lot more damage than those Cobalts are surviving. So even if it's not the best exchange, you're getting a much better exchange by this point in time than you used to be getting. So in the super late game, you're looking at a situation where for Vasari, capital ships become even more something I would say that they want to lean into rather than their other ships, but their other ships do again get even more upgrades compared to everyone else at this point in time, specifically like their durability and stuff like that, especially their like hull and self-regeneration. Those go completely nuts. But the big thing about the late game for Vasari is that they get access to 2,400 maximum supply. Yes, during the early late game they had like 2,100 maximum supply, and they got to 2,000 a little bit faster than everyone else. They got it at Tech Tier 4 instead of 5. Well, they got to 2,100 at Tech Tier 4. But basically, you're capable of producing more ships than any other faction in the game by this point in time. You've got mobile Orculuses that are capable of jumping into enemy areas, giving you functionally, I would put it around 2,600 fleet supply capable of jumping into enemy sectors. You've additionally got phase gates, which are going to make it so that you've got unparalleled strategic mobility, letting you move your fleets freely around the map in a way that other people can't, letting you defend where you need to defend much more effectively, letting you attack places that are vulnerable while still being able to move back and defend your own territory much more effectively. All of that makes it so that you're a really tremendous threat. And this is where Vasari become the scariest faction in the game, because not only are their ships pound for pound already really, really strong, your scaling has outpaced everybody else's because your tech goes to higher values. You've got access to the phase gates, which lets you always concentrate your forces. You've got the ability to jump your starbase into places. You've got more fleet supply than everybody else. A Vasari late game fleet that's at maximum is going to crush every other kind of fleet that's out there, barring some very unique shenanigans from your opponent, or a very knowledgeable opponent that's got you dead to rights encountered. So this is where I think Vasari are meant to be, like at their absolute apex. And I think that that's fine. I think that there's going to be a faction that's like strongest during each of the phases of the game. So my complaint for Vasari and what I would sort of change about them, I don't want them to be the early game faction. There were other patches where I think that they were actually kind of weak during the early game. That was when economies were way faster, where it was possible to sort of like pretty easily get the resources you need to fend off literally anything that the Vasari were throwing at you, even if you built sort of the wrong thing. That's not really the case right now, I don't feel like. Although that may be my build orders being bad. I feel like right now, slightly toning down what Vasari are capable of doing during the early game would be something I would like to see happen. The changes that I would like to see for that are mostly down again to better counters from tech or advent. But I would also like to see it changed where they no longer have their free source of exotics during the early game. I think it's fair that they have some relative advantage in terms of getting another capital ship because they have to start off with the egg. But I think that instead of giving them 8 additional free exotics at the start of the game, I think it would be better if they gave them the ability to build one capital ship without having to spend any exotics, but they still have to spend the metal and the crystal. So they get a half free capital ship at the start of the game. After that, they have no more exotics in the pool. They have to get their exotics just like everybody else. So they can start with a 2 capital ship opening, and it would cost a bunch of their metal and a bunch of their crystal, but they couldn't start with 3. The other thing, like I said, I think moving the Raiders to tier 2 so that they have to spend a little bit more time getting that, giving you a little bit more reactivity for the other factions. I think that they could also move the Genserac down to 1. But what I would also like to see is a bit of a swap here. Right now, the Volrak just does not have any particularly good place in the sort of roster here. And part of it's because their role is like to destroy star bases, but everything about their kit, other than their damage and their pierce values, make them pretty bad at that. What I would kind of like to see is for the Raiders to have some late game viability by giving them a tech during the sort of tier 3, maybe tier 4, that would make it so that they're survivable into enemy infrastructure in some ways. Maybe that they get additional damage reduction and a very, very high amount of it into enemy structures. That makes it so that they're capable of performing raids against heavily fortified systems that don't have enemy starships defending them, where they can sort of easily do a lot of damage to those types of structures while still, surviving that. And this would also give you a lot of that sort of like resource gain. So you'd probably want to put this into like tier 4 maybe for this kind of tech there. But having that ability to use raiders as your siege ships, destroying star bases with a large swarm of those, would be kind of interesting, I think, as a sort of difference between the Vasari and the other factions there. This, of course, leaves the Volrak Penetrator not having a role, but I think that what we would want to do in this instance is to change the Volrak from what it is to something that's got a 750 pierce value, where it's capable of hunting down Titans rather than hunting down star bases. And I think that if you're having it chase down Titans and command ships and capital ships and stuff like that, you could tweak its cost and stuff like that to make it a little bit more massable. Because you're talking about tier 4, and having it sort of do that role would make it so that you would want to be able to build quite a few of them, especially given that they're not necessarily that intimidating with their damage values. I would also like to make it so that Berserk Overcharge, instead of being built up over time as you sort of attack the target. If it was going after these kinds of targets, I would kind of prefer that Berserk Overcharge gained stacks every time the Volrak took damage, and basically have a sort of like enrage effect whenever it's being attacked. So if you sort of ignore them, they can kind of be slow. They can kind of be sort of kited around a little bit, and you can sort of pick them off one by one by one. That provides, I think, a little bit more interesting counterplay against Volrek that's a little bit cheaper, a little bit more massable. But basically, what'll happen is like you shoot one Volrak and you focus all the fire into it. It sort of rages forward, gets very, very fast, very quickly, does a lot of damage when it does hit, but hopefully it'll die before it can do too much, and then you sort of go to the next one, the next one, the next one. Whereas if you sort of hit them all with a big AoE, they sort of all berserk, and they like instantly kill like whatever it is they're going after. So I think that that would additionally create a sort of interesting dynamic where you can't really AoE light damage a whole bunch of Volrax. You have to sort of focus fire them down one by one by one. But that's just sort of my opinion there. I also think that Vasari are kind of missing one ship from their roster, I feel like. I'm not 100% sure what I would add to them in terms of the roster, because it's fairly full there. I do think that they could potentially do with maybe another frigate. Although I can't actually remember the Serevan is a frigate. I think it's not. But I do feel like there could be another ship squeezed into the roster for Vasari somewhere, just going based off sort of the numbers of things there. But yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on them. I don't like the fact, again, that they're predominant during the early game and the late game. With the middle slump, I think that that's a really weird sort of way to play them. I think that if you did make it so that their economy worked more conventionally, they would have that sort of more even curve where they're sort of weakest at the start there. They ramp up during the middle, and then they get really strong during the late game. But I think that the fact that they're unique in so many different ways, I think that that's something that you would want to hold on to. Now, I'm lumping both the Exiles and the Alliance into sort of one thing here. But I do think that right now, Vasari Alliance is just stronger than Vasari Exiles, whatever. Exodus, yeah. The Anarcho Wanderer, it's got its position. It's got a thing that it does. It's very, very good at it. But I think that's really, really kind of a poorly designed ship conceptually. The Verastra is very good, but it's definitely not holding a candle to the Verastro. Kultorask is what's called. I can never remember sorry names for things. But the Verastra, I think, is kind of fine, but it's nothing that's too special there. But the Kultorask from the Vasari Alliance is just on a league all of its own. It's just way, way, way too strong as it is. But yeah, I like the Vasari roster as a whole. I think it's got a lot of different interesting options to it. I think it's got a lot of just fun to use capital ships there in particular, which we didn't really discuss too much here because they're kind of the same, and we've got the videos discussing each of them in turn. I think that they definitely are one of those factions where you're going to probably lean a little bit more into those capital ships by the time you sort of hit the mid-game compared to Tech or Advent, but they still have a pretty good roster of regular ships as well. I do think that it would be nice if they sort of had maybe a little bit better synergy, but it's hard to say that that's the thing that they should be doing. They're the brute faction. Each of their ships are supposed to be really, really powerful individually, so giving them powerful synergies would probably tilt it too far in a different direction and probably make them overbearing. So the fact that their support ships are a little bit lackluster, it probably has to stay that way. But I would potentially like to see an interesting take on a Vasari style support ship that does something a little bit different from what the style of support is for that. That may be what might be what I want to see from Vasari, is a really out there support type ship that does a very different support type role than buff debuff, which is what you sort of typically see out of the support ships from the different factions there. I'm not sure what it would be, but I think that there could be something interesting that you could do with a frigate that does support roles for the Vasari there. But in any event, though, that's going to be our video for today. I hope you found this one enjoyable. And of course, as always, hope to see you guys all next time.